The wood should not exist. That is what the science keeps insisting every time another fragment is pulled from the collapsed ruins of a Norse farmstead in Greenland. The species is wrong. The grain is wrong. Everything about these pieces points to a forest that grew 2,000 kilometers away, across a stretch of open and freezing ocean. And yet, there it sits, buried in the soil of a settlement where it has no business being. For 100 years, we have told ourselves a tidy little story. One voyage. One windswept camp at the edge of Newfoundland. A decade, perhaps. And then the Vikings turned their backs on America and sailed home for good. End of story. But if they truly abandoned this continent 1,000 years ago, then why does North American wood keep surfacing in Greenland for the next 3 centuries? The answer was hiding inside the wood the entire time. For most of the last century, the story of the Vikings in America was a comfortable one, and comfortable stories are the hardest to dislodge. It went like this. Sometime around the year 1000, a handful of Norse sailors stumbled onto the northern tip of Newfoundland, scratched out a tiny camp, lingered for a few seasons, and then gave up and went home. One expedition, one location. A brief and rather charming detour at the very edge of the known world, before the Norse retreated back to Greenland and Iceland and let the continent slip out of memory. The history books treated it almost like a road trip, a glimpse of America, and then a shrug. And to be fair to the textbooks, the one place they anchored that story is rock solid. Meadows on the windswept coast of Newfoundland is the only site in all of the Americas where the academic world has formally agreed that Norse explorers set foot. The evidence there is not in dispute. In fact, it has only grown sharper with time. In 2021, a team of scientists led by researchers at the University of Groningen did something extraordinary. They pinned the Norse activity at that camp to a single exact year. 1021. Not a range, not an estimate. A precise year, 471 years before Columbus. The method behind that date is worth pausing on because it tells you how good the science has become. In the year 993, a violent storm erupted on the surface of the sun and flooded the earth with a sudden burst of radiation. Trees everywhere absorbed that burst into the ring they grew that season, locking a chemical signal into the wood that survives to this day. The researchers found that signal in 3 different pieces of wood from the Norse layers at Meadows, each one cut cleanly by a metal blade that the indigenous population did not possess. They simply counted the rings outward from that signal to the bark. 29 rings every time. The trees had been felled in 1021. 3 separate trees, 3 separate answers, all landing on the same year. So the camp is real, and the date is certain. But here is where the comfortable story starts to feel thin. Because for everything Meadows gave up, it withheld the one thing that would make it a colony. There were no cemeteries, no clear sign of families putting down roots. Brigida Wallace, the archaeologist who spent decades excavating the place for Parks Canada, has been blunt about what it actually was. It was a base, a seasonal outpost for repairing ships and smelting iron before pushing on or sailing home. People stayed a handful of years, and then they were gone. And that is exactly where the trap was laid. Everyone fixated on the camp. The whole debate, for 50 years, circled around that single patch of turf in Newfoundland. When the settlement closed, the story closed along with it, as if the Norse presence in America began and ended on that one beach. The question nobody thought to press was whether the camp was ever the point at all. Because the Norse did not cross an ocean for a view. They came for something, and the one thing they needed most could not be found at that camp, or anywhere in their entire frozen world. For that, they had no choice but to keep coming back. The thing the Norse needed, the thing their entire world was starved of, was wood. And to understand just how desperate that hunger was, you have to picture Greenland as it actually was, not as the name suggests. Greenland was very nearly treeless. The land produced little more than stunted dwarf birch and low, twisted willow, scrub that crept along the ground and snapped under any real weight. There was nothing there a builder could use, nothing you could shape into a keel, a roof beam, a barrel, or a plank. For a people whose entire civilization was built out of timber, this was not an inconvenience. It was an existential problem. Stop and think about how much wood a Norse life actually consumed. Their halls were timber, their churches were timber, their fences, their furniture, their tools, the handles of their axes, the staves of every barrel that held their food and drink, all of it came from trees. And then there were the ships. A single longship swallowed an astonishing quantity of carefully chosen timber, and a ship was not a thing you built once and forgot. In the damp, salt-bitten climate of the North Atlantic, vessels rotted, split, and needed constant repair. Every hull that sagged, every boat that leaked, every tool that broke demanded more wood, and Greenland could provide almost none of it. A colony that ran on timber had planted itself in one of the few inhabited places on Earth where timber would not grow. So, where did it come from? For a long time, the answer scholars reached for was a tidy one. Driftwood, they said, carried across the Arctic on ocean currents from the great forests of Siberia, washing up on Greenland's shores for anyone willing to collect it. And what driftwood could not supply, the Norse simply imported, hauling expensive timber across the sea from Norway. It was a neat explanation. It kept the Greenlanders dependent on currents and on the old country, and it asked no awkward questions about where else they might have looked. But there was always a loose thread in that explanation, and the thread was in the sagas. The old Icelandic accounts mention more than once that the Norse sailed to a place they called Markland, the land of forests, to gather timber. They named the journeys. They named the people who made them. And for most of the 20th century, historians read those passages and waved them away. Folklore, they decided. Exaggeration. Stories embroidered by storytellers centuries after the fact, the kind of heroic flourish you add to make an ancestor sound bold. A timber run did not fit the romance of the Viking, so it was quietly filed under fiction. Now hold those two things side by side. On one hand, a colony gasping for wood it could not grow, in a place where every beam and every boat had to come from somewhere else. On the other, its own written records calmly describing voyages across the water to harvest exactly that, dismissed as fantasy. When you frame it that way, the sagas stop sounding like legend. They start sounding like something far more mundane and far more revealing. A shipping record, a logistics report, the everyday accounting of a people solving the single greatest shortage of their existence. The trouble was that the sagas were only words, and words can always be argued away. For 100 years, that is exactly what happened, until someone finally decided to stop reading the stories about the wood and start reading the wood itself. The person who decided to read the wood itself was an archaeologist at the University of Iceland named Elisabeth Gudmundsdottir, and in 2023 she published a study in the journal Antiquity that did something the sagas never could. It produced physical, testable, undeniable evidence. She and her team gathered wood from 5 Norse sites scattered across western Greenland. 4 were medium-sized farms, the homes of ordinary settlers. 1 was a high-status manor, the seat of the local bishop. And critically, these were not all from one fleeting moment. The sites had been occupied across a long stretch of time, from roughly the year 1000 all the way through to the 1400. 4 centuries of Norse life, with the wood from each era waiting to be examined. The method she used is called wood taxa analysis, and it is worth understanding because it is the difference between a story and a fact. Every species of tree has a hidden architecture. Down at the cellular level, in the structure of its vessels and fibers, an oak is built differently from a pine, and a pine is built differently from a hemlock. That microscopic blueprint survives in the wood for centuries, long after the tree is dead and the bark is gone. Slice a fragment thin enough, put it under a microscope, and you can read the species off its cells the way you might read a fingerprint off a glass. More than that, the species tells you where the wood could possibly have come from. Some trees grew in Greenland, some arrived as driftwood, and some could only have come from one place on Earth. When her team worked through the fragments, most of what they found was exactly what you would expect. A great deal of it was local scrub or driftwood, the everyday material of a poor colony. A portion of it was European, oak and beech and Scots pine, the kind of timber that arrived as barrel staves and worked goods from across the Atlantic. None of that broke any rules. But then, scattered through the assemblage, the team found pieces that did not belong to any of those categories. They found hemlock. They found jack pine. And those two species change everything. Here is why. Hemlock and jack pine did not grow in Northern Europe in the early second millennium. They did not grow in Greenland. And they could not have drifted there because the ocean currents that carry driftwood to Greenland flow from the wrong direction entirely, out of the Siberian Arctic, not the American coast. There was only one forest on the planet where those species grew within reach of a Norse ship: the eastern seaboard of North America. The wood had not floated to Greenland. Someone had sailed across the water, cut it from living trees, and carried it home. Now, in the interest of honesty, the scale of it was small. The unmistakably American wood was a tiny fraction of everything the team examined, well under 1% of the total, and the establishment will lean on that number hard, as if a small quantity makes the finding trivial. But quantity was never the point. The point is that it exists at all. You do not accidentally end up with American hemlock in a Greenland farmhouse. Its mere presence proves a voyage was made, a tree was felled, and a ship came back. And the moment you stop asking how much and start asking when, the entire comfortable timeline does not just bend, it snaps clean in half. Remember what the textbooks say. Lance o' Meadows was occupied around the year 1021. The Norse lingered a few short years, and then the camp was abandoned and the American adventure was over. That is the line. That is where the story is supposed to end. Contact begins and ends on a single beach in Newfoundland, within a single human lifetime, and never resumes. But the wood will not cooperate with that story. Because when Gudmund's daughter's team looked at where in time their American hemlock and jack pine actually came from, the pieces were not clustered around the year 1021 at all. They were spread across the centuries. The American wood turned up at sites occupied in the 11th century. It turned up in the 12th. It appears in contexts reaching into the 13th and on into the 14th. In other words, North American timber kept arriving in Greenland long after Lance o' Meadows had fallen silent. Generation after generation, the wood from across the ocean kept coming. Sit with what that actually means, because it is not a small adjustment to the story. It is a different story entirely. This was not the leftover residue of one famous voyage. The crossings of the Davis Strait, that brutal stretch of water between Greenland and the North American coast, did not stop when the camp closed. They continued. The study's own authors put it plainly. The Norse Greenlanders had the means, the knowledge, and the vessels to reach the eastern coast of North America at least as late as the 14th century. Not once, repeatedly, as an ongoing fact of life. Now, do the arithmetic, because the numbers are staggering. The Norse settled Greenland around the year 985. The American timber in the ground confirms they were still crossing to the North American coast in the 1300s. Lay those two dates end to end, and you are looking at a window of contact stretching somewhere close to 3.5 centuries. 350 years of a European people reaching the shores of America, harvesting from it, and sailing home. To put that in perspective, that is longer than the United States has so far existed. The entire history of America as a nation would fit comfortably inside the gap the Norse kept crossing. A word of honesty here, because it matters. This was not 3.5 centuries of continuous occupation. Nobody is claiming a permanent Norse town stood on the American coast that whole time. What the wood proves is a span of repeated, intermittent contact, voyages made across many generations whenever they were needed. But intermittent contact across 3 centuries is, if anything, the more remarkable claim. A single, heroic expedition is an adventure. 300 years of routine return voyages is a relationship. And suddenly, those saga passages, the ones historians spent a century dismissing as folklore, look completely different. The casual mentions of sailing to Markland for timber were never exaggerated boasts. They were describing precisely what the wood now confirms. Ordinary, repeated, working voyages to harvest a resource the colony could not live without. Not legend. Logistics, written down centuries before anyone could prove it. So the wood has told us the boats kept coming, again and again, for 300 years and more. But wood is cargo, and cargo can only tell you so much. It cannot tell you who was standing on the far shore when those ships arrived. For that, we need an entirely different kind of evidence, written not in timber, but in blood. Here is the thing the cargo cannot capture. If Norse crews were returning to the same stretches of North American coast for 3 centuries, season after season, generation after generation, then they were not arriving at an empty wilderness. That coast already had people on it. People who had lived there for thousands of years, who knew every inlet and every river mouth. And when two peoples meet at the same shore again and again across that much time, something passes between them. The question is whether we can still find a trace of it. As it turns out, we can. And it was hiding in the most intimate place imaginable. In the blood of living human beings. In 2010, a team of geneticists working at the Icelandic company Decode, led by the researcher Agnar Helgason, published a finding in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology that stopped people cold. While mapping the ancestry of modern Icelanders, they had found something that did not fit. More than 80 living Icelanders carried a particular signature in their mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down only along the maternal line from mother to child to child. They named the lineage C1e, and it matched nothing in the European gene pool. It did not belong there. So, where did it belong? The most likely answer the researchers reached is the one that makes the hair on your arm stand up. The C1e lineage appears to descend from the broader genetic family carried by the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and the most economical explanation for how an American maternal line ended up woven into the bloodline of an isolated North Atlantic island is almost unbearably human. Around the year 1000, a Native American woman was carried back across the ocean by Norse voyagers to Greenland and onward to Iceland, where she lived, and bore children and passed her genetic signature down through the centuries to people walking the streets of Reykjavik today. Now, in fairness, the scientists themselves have been careful, and their caution is exactly why this deserves to be taken seriously. The C1e lineage has not yet been found in any living Native American population either, which means an Asian or even an obscure European origin cannot be entirely ruled out. The researchers did not declare a verdict, they proposed a hypothesis, and they stated its limits openly. But that restraint is the mark of real science, not weak science. They followed the evidence precisely as far as it would go, and the place it points most strongly is west, across the water, to the same coast the timber came from. And once again, the sagas were there first. The Norse who reached those shores wrote of the people they encountered, calling them the Skraelingar. The accounts describe trade. They describe conflict. They describe goods changing hands and, at times, blood spilled. What they do not describe is an empty land. They describe a coast that was inhabited by people the Norse met, bargained with, fought, and in at least one quiet human moment may have loved. So look at what we now have. The wood says the ships kept crossing for 300 years. The blood says that on at least one of those crossings, a person made the journey too. Two completely separate sciences, timber under a microscope and DNA in a vial, pointing at the same buried truth. Which leaves only one question worth asking. If the evidence was there all along, why did the experts spend an entire century insisting that none of it ever happened? The answer is not a single mistake. It is three forces working quietly together, and the first one is the simplest. We got it wrong because we were looking for the wrong thing. When historians searched for evidence of Europeans in early America, they were searching for colonies, permanent towns, stone foundations in churches and graveyards, the kind of lasting settlement that later Europeans would build, designed to stand for centuries. And by that measure, they found almost nothing, so they concluded almost nothing had happened. But the Norse were never trying to build that. They treated North America the way a modern fishing fleet treats the open sea, a distant resource zone, immensely valuable, but too remote and too dangerous to live in. You sail out, you take what you came for, and you go home. Their camps were seasonal, temporary, often dismantled when the crews departed, leaving little more than a scatter of post holes for the soil to swallow. We hunted for cities and missed the harvest stations entirely. The second force is that the tools simply did not exist. The science that finally cracked this open is astonishingly new. Reading a tree's species from its cellular structure, tracing timber to a precise forest, pulling a maternal lineage out of living blood and dating its arrival, none of this was possible a generation ago. The verdicts that hardened into textbook fact were reached 100 years ago, with the instruments of 100 years ago, by scholars who genuinely could not have known better. The problem was never that they reached a conclusion. The problem is that the conclusion was never retested when the tools finally caught up. It was simply inherited, decade after decade, as settled truth. And that points to the third force, the quietest and the most stubborn of all, institutional inertia. Once a story is written into the textbooks, carved onto the museum placards, and taught to every new generation of students, it develops a gravity of its own. The idea that Columbus reached a fresh and empty continent, and that the Norse merely glimpsed America once and fled, has been the foundation of the story for over 100 years. To overturn it means more than admitting a fact. It means rereading the sagas that were filed as fantasy and recognizing them as records. It means finally listening to indigenous oral histories, the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk accounts of pale strangers who arrived from the sea in great wing canoes, stories that were dismissed for generations as myth. And it means conceding that the experts were wrong, while the storytellers and the elders were closer to right all along. That is never an easy thing for any establishment to say out loud. There is one more correction the evidence forces, and it concerns how the whole thing actually ended. The Norse did not lose interest in America and walk away. The crossing stopped because the Greenland colony that launched them collapsed. In the 1400s, the climate cooled, the Atlantic crossings grew deadlier, European trade routes shifted away, and the Black Death gutted the wider world that Greenland depended on. The base that had sent ships west for 3 centuries quietly died, and when it died, the memory died with it. By the time Columbus set sail in 1492, the Norse achievement had been forgotten everywhere on Earth, except in a handful of Icelandic sagas that the rest of Europe had long since written off as fairy tales. But the wood does not lie. The blood does not lie. And both of them have only just begun to speak. So gather the threads and hold them together. The impossible hemlock buried in a Greenland ruin. American timber surfacing century after century, long after the camp fell silent. A genetic signature carried home in the maternal line, alive in Iceland to this day. Saga passages dismissed as fantasy that turned out to be shipping records. No single thread proves the whole, but woven together they describe something the textbooks never permitted. Not one voyage, but a relationship, sustained across 3 centuries and more. The Norse were never explorers who came and left. They were commuters to a coast they treated as their own, and the questions that remain only deepen. How many lost camps still wait along that shore? What became of the children born of those meetings? Had Greenland not collapsed? Would the Vikings still have been crossing when Columbus arrived? Every answer the evidence gives only uncovers a deeper one beneath it.